My video about Stephen C. Meyer's argument from epistemological necessity a couple of weeks ago received pushback from some viewers who claimed that it failed to undermine Meyer's argument. So I wanted to take some time to respond to those claims, since I think the people making them either don't understand Meyer's actual argument or misunderstood what I was trying to say in my response to it. Either way, I feel a bit more clarification is warranted here, so take this video as an adjunct to my previous one. Okay, so starting with Leonard U6094, he says, you ask, if our minds were designed by God to be able to understand the universe, then why did it take so long for us to be able to understand it this well? I'm really confused as to how you think this is an undercutting question. Okay, so here's why it's undercutting. The question you need to ask yourself is, do the properties of our mind fit better with Meyer's hypothesis that our minds have been designed by God to be reliable, or with the naturalistic hypothesis of their origin that says that our minds have evolved over millions of years to allow for our survival? Because remember, Meyer is arguing that only a supernatural cause can explain why our minds are reliable. The supernatural cause, of course, being God.
And so it came down, you couldn't justify the reliability of assumptions we make in our minds by observing the world. You had to use those assumptions to make sense of the observations. But if you presupposed that our minds were made by a benevolent creator who gave us those assumptions in order to make sense of the world that he also made, then there was a principle of correspondence between the way the mind worked and the way the world worked, in which case we could trust the basic reliability of the mind. And this turns out to be...
Now, my entire argument here is arguing against this assumption by presenting evidence that shows how the myriad limitations of our minds strongly suggest a natural cause for their existence. The specific natural cause being evolution through natural selection over millions of years. I explicitly mentioned this in my video, but in case you missed it, here it is again. Hardware. The point I'm making here is that our minds aren't designed to be able to comprehend the universe. They simply evolved to comprehend the bare minimum of our immediate environment, which we need for our survival. If we didn't even have this bare minimum comprehension of our local environment, then we would not have survived as a species. Just like 99% of all the other species that have ever existed, which have all gone extinct because they weren't able to adapt to their environments. So it's not at all surprising or bewildering that we are able to comprehend our world. It's a prerequisite for our existence. And now, had God designed our minds to be reality comprehension devices, as Meyer claims, then there was no reason to design them with limitations that strongly imply that they are the product of millions of years of evolution by natural selection. This is why I started off by pointing out how long it took us to understand the universe well, because it demonstrates how our minds have so many inherent biases and flaws that it took us over 99.9% of our existence as a species to realize that the Earth wasn't flat. So again, my question is, given these limitations, biases, and flaws of our minds, which hypothesis fits better with how our minds work? Does it fit better with the hypothesis that our minds were created by an omniscient designer who specifically designed them to be reliable? Or does it fit better with the hypothesis that our minds are the products of a naturalistic process like evolution, which would only require it to be reliable in the areas that are necessary for survival? Meyer claims that supernatural design is the only possible answer. He doesn't even try to address why naturalistic processes could not have produced our minds, let alone why all the specific limitations of our minds that I've pointed out strongly imply that it was the product of naturalistic processes. The fact that Meyer insists that it must have been a supernatural omniscient being that specifically designed our minds to be reliable, despite the myriad ways it's clearly not reliable, shows how completely ideologically motivated his reasoning is here. This is not a good argument, even when compared to other arguments for theism. It's simply willful blindness to the reality of how our minds work. Anyway, the rest of Leonard's comment doesn't add to his response, so I'm moving on to the next comment. Extinct Zebroid says, you seem to have thoroughly debunked the idea that humans are omniscient. Meyer's actual argument remains untouched. So this is yet again an example of someone who neither understood Meyer's argument nor my counter to it. As I mentioned in my reply to the previous commenter, Meyer's argument is that the reliability of our minds proves that it must be divinely designed. My response wasn't to show that we are not omniscient. It was to show that our minds are not reliable. Those are two very different things. I gave several examples of how our minds are very easy easy to deceive in circumstances that are not important to our survival as a species. Our susceptibility to this particular optical illusion that it presented wasn't done to argue that we are ignorant. Even when you can see the truth of this illusion and you know that the squares labeled A and B are the exact same color, it still appears as if the squares are different colors. Why is that? It's not because you don't know the truth here. You already know that they are the exact same color. And it's not because your eyes are seeing the colors incorrectly either. Because if it was a problem with your eyes, you would not be able to see that these colors are the same when these squares are connected like this. It's because our minds are unreliable. Even when we know that the colors are the same, our minds still look at this image and start firing the neurons that tells us that these colors are different. We know better, but that doesn't matter. Basically, what this shows is that in all areas that weren't necessary for our survival as a species, there is no guarantee for the reliability of our minds. And there was no need for God to make our minds in such a manner as to make them so grossly reliable in these circumstances. This is clearly an outcome of evolutionary pressure on us as a species. So to reiterate, my response to Meyer isn't an argument about our ignorance as a species or about us not having perfect and complete knowledge of the universe. It is expressly an argument about our minds being unreliable. Now, ZBRUD misunderstands the argument I made here despite the numerous examples I gave, but that's not surprising now, is it? Because like I said, our minds are not reliable. Moving on, Estienne M. Allen 1, I'm just going to call him Allen, says, how do you know you can trust the refutation your brain just conjured up for this video? Well, I don't need to trust the refutation, Allen. You need to prove it is invalid, and good luck with that. Okay, so to elaborate on Allen's point a bit, he makes an interesting argument here, but sadly it is entirely irrelevant to the response I'd made. So what Allen is trying to argue here with his rhetorical question is that since God is a prerequisite for the reliability of our minds to be valid, then any argument rejecting God is self-defeating, since it relies on the reliability of our minds to be valid. If our minds are unreliable, then any argument emerging from our minds will also be unreliable. So in this way, we are forced to admit to the reliability of our minds, and that requires the existence of God. Okay, so I'm sure you can see several problems with this argument that Allen makes here. First, it's begging the question. It assumes that only God's existence can explain the reliability of the mind, without justifying this assumption. This is the same thing that Meyer has done in his argument too. My counter-argument was there is no reason to believe that a naturalistic explanation cannot also produce a reasonably reliable mind. And until Meyer or Allen are able to refute this possibility, there is no reason for anyone to accept that God is the only explanation for our minds. In fact, this argument can actually be completely turned around on its head. I can argue exactly the opposite of what Allen is arguing here by using the same reasoning he's using and come to the exact opposite conclusion. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to claim that God's non-existence is necessary for the reliability of the mind. That is, I'm making the claim that only if God doesn't exist can our minds possibly be reliable. Now, of course, I don't actually believe this. I'm just using this to demonstrate Allen's flawed reasoning. Okay, so now Allen's response will probably be to point out the flaws in this claim of mine, which is unsupported by either empirical evidence or reason. But then, just like Allen did, I will simply respond to his refutation with, how do you know you can trust the refutation your brain just conjured up, Allen? Basically implying that Allen's response is self-defeating since it assumes the reliability of the mind, but that requires that God does not exist. See how easy that was, Allen? Anyway, moving on. Okay, so I've saved the best for last. Shlooptime has posted a lengthy reply that I think definitely warrants a response since he's made a legitimate effort here to bolster Meyer's argument. I'm assuming that Shlooptime's a he. It's a pretty solid bet that anyone arguing about God's existence on YouTube is going to be male, so it's a safe assumption. So there are two parts to Shloop's response. One, addressing my counter-argument to Meyer, the other presenting a more rigorous version of Meyer's own argument for the epistemological necessity of God. For the first part, Shloop says, it's obvious that a creationist isn't arguing that human minds equals God's mind, which is what you've debunked in the first third of the video. So here, unfortunately, he's made the same mischaracterization that all previous commenters have made. I never argued that our minds are perfect. My argument was, given the particular flaws and limitations of our minds, the non-supernatural hypothesis about our minds, specifically the one stating that our minds have evolved over millions of years, makes much more sense than Meyer's hypothesis. Please see the response to the first couple of comments I made earlier in this video for more details on this. The second part is where Shloop is attempting to present a more rigorous version of Meyer's argument, and this is how he has phrased it. I will be going through this step by step to assess test the validity of his points. Point 1. He says that there is only one reality, namely the universe, which means that the universe is true. Completely agree with that. Point 2. He says that this reality is the same to all observers. That is, the truth of the universe is objective. Again, completely agree. No objection here. Point 3. Objective truths are understandable. Now, I assume he means some objective truths are understandable, which I agree with. It's not necessarily true that all objective truths are understandable, but I'm pretty sure that's what he means too. So, agree on all 3 points. Then he says, from these 3 premises, we can conclude a true understanding of an objectively true universe must also be objective, and completely disagree. An understanding of a thing, even if it is correct, is still subjective. That's the very definition of understanding, which is how a being with a mind comprehends something. An understanding requires an understander, and that makes the act of understanding necessarily subjective. Again, remember that it can still be 100% correct. Just because it's subjective doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that there is a subject required to carry out that act of understanding. So Shloop, what you've done here is you've jumped from point 3 where you claim that objective truths are understandable to the claim that objectively true understanding must also be objective. That's where you slipped up, because this doesn't follow from any of your 3 premises or their combination. What follows from your 3 premises is that objectively true understanding is true, not that objectively true understanding is objective. The rest of your argument breaks down from here on, since it relies on this notion of the existence of an unproven objective understanding. Anyway, this was an interesting argument, but it suffers from the same flaws as the entire class of arguments that rely on a similar structure as that of the transcendental argument for the existence of God, or TAG for short. If you're not familiar with it, you should read up about it on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Or if you want to see its summarized form and all its criticisms made by atheists on a wiki which catalogs all theistic arguments and their flaws, see the rationalwiki.org page for it here. Anyway, moving on. As a bonus comment, Shoopink, now this is a completely different commenter from the previous one, just a very similar username. So Shoopink says, I did not evolve. Well, neither did I, Shoop, neither did I.